Okay, thank you very much. If we could bring the slides up. I'm going to take a little while and first of all take a step back on the issues of mortality and then dive off the deep end and probably repeat some of the things you've heard yesterday and today, but hopefully give some context. I got drawn into the subject of mortality some time ago. Growing up on a pig farm, I remember when sow mortality was not a problem, and it was a rarity on my parents' farm when we dragged a sow out of the barn. And it has changed over time, and it's partly our creation. I think the second area where it really came to the fore was when I began as Anna working in animal welfare. We did a short survey of people working in the barns, and I was being bothered by the fact that everyone else was naming welfare concerns on the farm. And in the sow herd, the big concern was downer sows and dead sows to the people working on the farm as an identified welfare concern as well. And then over time, looking at the economic outcomes of mortality, I became convinced that we, in many cases, were underestimating the cost to the system. And so I'm going to exhibit some of that as well. The first thing to point out about mortality is the broad variation from farm to farm, region to region, and the like. And I follow some of the quality management emphasis of Junichi Taguchi, who says, if there's variation, there's opportunity. There's solutions within our population that we haven't found yet. And therefore, much of the research being done right now digs into that opportunity, because we're seeing changes over time between farms and between regions that we simply need to understand in more detail. But sow mortality probably is definitionally one of the most complicated areas to study. It's not easy. We can't get hold of all the variables. We're working with sparse data over time. It's a long time frame for a sow to study mortality or lifetime changes. Almost invariably, we have multifactorial causes. And not only are they multifactorial, but many of those causes are unstable over time. And I'll show some of that. And because of these factors, instead of doing experimental studies, we're stuck with observational studies, the area where myself as an epidemiologist, I cut my teeth in this area. And one of the first things I learned as an epidemiologist was that causes are inferred, that we don't have direct proof within observational studies of an effect, and we need to use subjective interpretation of the results that we see. And it involves a community such as this, and I look forward to the discussions to start understanding what actually is driving sow mortality. I want to take a step back further and explain that much of my last 15 years, I've also been involved in One Health projects and led a project on addressing emerging infectious diseases in Central Africa and Southeast Asia. And mortality was a concern. And what surprised me as I worked in some of these countries was, number one, when we looked at mortality, it was opportunity cost models. It was trying to define areas where the losses were the greatest, and therefore an emphasis on maternal and child health was very important and very similar to the challenges we have on our sow farms. And they used something called disability-adjusted life years. In other words, they asked how many productive years or time can we achieve in our populations. And so we had a target age and looked at deviations from that target age and looked at deviations from not only in terms of lifespan, but also inability to be productive. Disability adjustments, such as disease, such as impairments, became important. And so it focused on that loss of productivity, but importantly, they realized that looking backwards at a life wasn't very accurate, and it's very biased, and therefore developing that database takes time because we have to look at causes of mortality to gain objectivity in terms of prospective analysis, identifying the factors as we go along through a lifespan. What also surprised me was that there is a group called the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation that looked at this in detail across the world and did comparisons. And this is looking at 100% of maternal losses and looked at contributions and estimates of contributions to losses in that population. The interesting part is this institute is funded to the level of $600 million over the last decade or so. And therefore the investment to actually look at this and contribute to the discussion and identify focused areas of investment, especially in development in burgeoning countries such as DRC, it needs some of that analysis, and it's very impressive to see the investment here and the time you have put into this as well. I want to emphasize one last thing. Though it may seem foreign that we compare human and pig health, one of the first lessons I needed to learn going into DRC was that the gross domestic product per person was less than rearing a hog in Minnesota, and even more so for sows in comparison to mothers. And therefore, it is a limited resource environment in many countries, and it was interesting to see the parallels and also heartening that myself as a swine veterinarian could contribute to that discussion. What I learned time after time was that death certificates are biased and constrained in providing information for health metrics. And that's probably one of the biases we have in our systems, that we rely too much on looking at the causes that we see in PigChamp or other record-keeping systems as the actual cause of death and the manipulation. I also learned that I needed to, as a swine vet, to listen to dairy vets. If there is a similar population and a similar set of research, it's within the dairy industry. And inviting a dairy vet onto a farm and examining some of the concerns around sow longevity, or as they call it, cow comfort, is a real eye-opener, and they've been investing for some time. Lameness has been mentioned a number of times, and I'll mention it as well. They have proceedings that are this thick as far as information concerning lameness in dairy cows. They haven't solved it by any means, but they understand it in many cases and have reduced it through quite intensive investment in the care of dairy cows. I also want to emphasize the economics. One of the odd things way back when for my PhD is I did most of my coursework in economics and especially production economics. And the first thing I learned is to identify the best case scenario. And two things I want to point out here. We didn't talk a lot about culling, but in theory, culling should be protective against mortality. And in many cases it is, and we'll dig in a bit more. But a best case scenario is culling at the appropriate parity, and the appropriate parity, if you want to analyze it, is just taking your average profit per parity and checking when it exceeds the marginal profit for the last parity you're concerned about. And that often ends up being around 5, 6, 7. The other success measure is that you can cull it and get a high value at slaughter. But the other measure is that that sow is immediately replaced, and that's at point of weaning. And that is an opportunity cost of 0 for losing that animal. And really, mortality at that point, if you have to euthanize the sow, is simply lost slaughter income. It's the best case scenario also for mortality. And everything else is a deviation from that point. And we can take it into some more detail, but realize what we're trying to do with age is really amortizing gilt introduction costs. And I think we often underestimate the cost of gilt introduction. We, of course, have the purchase costs. And as mentioned, there's rearing costs. We also need to take into account the retention rate of gilts. But in some more detail, where we often struggle is actually introducing the gilts at the economically optimal point. In other words, replacing the correct sows and having the gilts available at the right time. We also need to remember that in many herds we have second parity effects. It doesn't only affect entry, but it extends into the second parity. And finally, we need to recognize that the progeny are of lower value from a gilt. We can see differences in growth rates, we can see differences in some cases in number, but especially in infectious status. And I'm going to argue that that infectious status is not only an insult, potential insult to the pig itself, but to the pigs around them. And that's what I call atomistic or pig-by-pig analysis versus looking at the whole population. And therefore, things such as segregation of progeny from gilts has been used in the past to control some of those pathogen effects. So, taking into that account, we have to realize that we're not amortizing those gilt introduction costs if we lose a sow or a gilt in the first litter. It gets worse if it's later in pregnancy. It gets worse if you're already short on farrowings in that breeding group. It gets worse if not only you're short in that group, but you're not weaning enough in that group, and it can extend into the next farrowing group as well. And rarely do we see it directly affecting the number of farrowings, but we see it indirectly affecting in terms of lost income by having suboptimal breedings, retaining sows you shouldn't be keeping, breeding gilts early, but trying to meet that breeding target. And we increase the gilt costs in many cases associated with that. And then finally, we may have prior costs prior to that mortality due to some of the pathologies that we're struggling with that actually cause the mortality, those treatment costs and the like that aren't always successful. So there's a full range there, and we can attribute greater than $1,000 and in some cases $2,000 under highly profitable situations with a sow mortality under a worst case scenario. But it's that range we're working with. I want to emphasize that compensatory behaviors when we have instability in our supply of sows can stretch into weaning age, can stretch into group integrity, and as mentioned, stretch into retention of marginal sows. And that quality flow, that ability to manage through week by week through our systems is important. And I want to dig in a bit deeper and say, also look at reproductive reasons. What bothers me in some cases is that we're predicting future reproductive performance based on prior reproductive performance. But is it repeatable? Is the fact that she return to estrus twice repeatable for the third time. In many cases it is. But in reality, if it is, there's some pathology behind that. And the pathologies that we talk about, such as inflammatory responses and the like, can also lead to higher mortality. They are not unrelated. And in many cases, culling and mortality are not unrelated either. The other problem is, in terms of flow, in terms of managing the problem, is that mortality clusters over time. It's not a random event. And though it would be nice if we could predict that week by week, we would be dragging out 2, 3, 4 sows. In fact, we all know that it clusters in certain weeks and at certain times and the like. And we've seen across a larger database that the first sow increases the likelihood of the second sow dying in the same week. In other words, they group together. And some of that is seasonality and also infectious diseases. But we're finding also that we see this misselection of sows that result in a group that has a higher mortality. In other words, we're keeping back sows we shouldn't be keeping when we're short of gilts, and we see higher mortality in those groups as well. So what do we measure if we're trying to address this? Longevity is the outcome of most concern. It's a major production concern. It's really handy because we measure it accurately. A lot of things in pig production we don't measure that accurately, but in this case we diligently record our sow mortality, and very rarely do we have problems with that measurement. But it is at the end of the causal pathway. Everything that caused it is beforehand, and therefore we struggle in some cases with what we call a causality. Because really good causal epidemiologic studies involve prospective data, and we have to be cynical about looking back and predicting what happens because we're biased. We got to put some reason down, and our memory is limited. In some cases, we use pathology, though even in that case, there can be multiple pathologies, and it's hard to identify the last one. And often, we're simply looking at the external aspects of the sow. One other secret about analyzing sow data is that p-values are pretty easy to attain. As I began my career many years ago and using databases such as PigChamp, it's easy to get a p-value. That's not really the aim. The aim is to find population attributable fractions. In other words, what can we take away as a cause and truly affect the outcome? Where do we get the biggest bang for the buck? Seasonality is a big one, but how do you get rid of season? Lactational feed intake, as we've looked at that on a day-by-day basis, we can find that lactational feed intake is a real challenge in populations, and we can get population attributable fractions in the region of 20 to 30% in many of our herds. That if we kept up feed intake all the way through lactation, we'd see a real decrease in our mortality rate. The big one in my hands is lameness, and it's been mentioned a number of times. And lameness is underestimated. It's undermeasured, and it's not identified in enough detail. And I've gotten population attributable fractions as high as 50%. That half the mortality is associated with lameness. And I see some nodding out there. So how do we go forward and analyze it in more detail and figure out what we're supposed to do? First of all, realize that you're inferring causation from correlation. I'm going to show you correlates, but we're going to test them in a number of different ways. Looking at correlates is always a challenge. If you've ever had a discussion with a child about why did the truck get stuck in the side of the road, the answer would be, well, the road was slippery. And the adult or the parent question is, but did you slow down because the road was slippery? And it's a fair answer, but it's a useless answer saying the road was slippery until we talk about what we did to control the situation as well. And that's what we need to talk about. Causality only takes p-value, which is that strength of association, as a small part of understanding what causes an outcome. And there's a number of different sets of criteria, but the Bradford-Hill criteria is probably the most common, that we can do stats, and p-values are important. Experiments can be done, except in many cases not in mortality studies. But we look at other factors, such as plausibility. Does it make sense? Is it consistent across different situations? Is there a dose-response relationship? Does mortality get worse with an increased amount of lameness? And temporality is a big one. Does the outcome occur after the insult to the population? And this is a set of about a dozen lectures to our epidemiology students to actually work through, frankly, on a subjective basis, on the evaluation of causes. We talk about pathways, informed pathways. They're based on experiences in barns. Otherwise, they're based on an understanding of biology. They're based on an analysis of behavior. One of the simple questions is, where do we see behavioral changes in our sows in reaction to insults? And interaction between sows and floors is one of them. Sows and other sows and agonistic behavior is another, and sows and temperature can be a third. But we can separate out behaviors. We look at timelines as far as what happens after lameness and what are the intermediate steps, and what are the concurrent factors that we have to account for to really drill down and understand a factor such as lameness. So here's an example. The argument against lameness is it's poorly defined. It's subjective. You look at a sow and see whether it has changed its gait. It's undermeasured, not only because we often don't record it when there is a lame sow in our record-keeping systems, or frankly, invariably almost do not record it, but sows also hide lameness. We've done experiments that show less than 80% of sows that are lame in the pen show it when they walk to the farrowing crate. It's poorly recorded. I don't consider recording as effective until negatives are recorded as well. In other words, a plus or a minus is needed in our records. We need to understand which ones heal, which ones are culled, which ones die. It causes lower productivity, and productivity can be an indirect measure of lameness, but I doubt that lameness is an indirect measure of productivity in a causal pathway. It interacts with other concerns and factors in longevity, feed intake, temperature, and the like. It's simply measured, and I would argue that most of the information you can get is not by doing a 5-point evaluation of lameness, but simply absence or presence. And even when we use relatively inexperienced students, we have found that it's highly predictive. It parallels other species as far as a challenge. And frankly, as I've mentioned a number of times, it's not regularly measured. In terms of biologic logic, I've said it a number of times to different crowds, these are like ballerinas. They're walking on their tippy toes, that they're walking on their fingernails, for lack of better terms. and therefore subject to injury in many cases. I mentioned sensitivity and specificity of measurement. We're working with a sensitivity and specificity of the low 80s, according to our measures of ability to measure lameness. It's not bad, not great, but when we take a look at its prospective predictive power, when we have simply measured lameness of sows going to the farrowing crate and looked at subsequent productivity, the amount of pigs that are expected from a sow after weaning, the difference is very, very large based on a very simple measurement. And that difference has been showing up time and time again in a prevalence in many herds of 20% or greater. One last little geeky thing is that if we do a path model, we can see, for instance, that lameness can result in low productivity, it can result in removal, and understanding the interactions is important. This isn't true in all cases, but we've seen in a few cases where almost all the productivity deviations and reasons for removal in terms of productivity was actually due to a prior lameness measurement. That lameness was a much better predictor of reasons for removal than low productivity ever was. And so if we measure lameness, we can change the predictiveness of low productivity as a reason for removal from almost nothing in the case of not measuring lameness to a highly significant measure of reasons to removal, but it's really because lameness is behind productivity. So we have a cascade of drivers. We have a supply of gilts of a certain genetics. Conformation is involved in lameness. Nutrition is involved in lameness. Flooring, of course, is involved. And I would add agonistic behavior showed up time and time again. And therefore, some of the concerns about pen systems of sows that are often nasty to each other has to be a concern. Interactions with season, with feed intake, with treatment effects, and with culling need to be understood, but the further you go back and the closer you get to a controllable pathology, the better off you are. There's multiple points of estimation. It's complicated. I think a number of people have measured. There's multiple tests for causality that we need to take into account. We need to estimate early. The cost of mortality is higher in early parities, and there's more of them. And if they do last, there's longer potential outcomes. We need to focus on certain outcomes based on discussions such as these. We need to measure not only what we call the outcome, but the predictors that are in our systems, and we don't have enough of those. For our last thought, from the Institute for Health Measurement and Economics, no estimate of a problem is interpreted as an estimate of no problem. And what we don't measure, we don't look at. So I'll leave it at that with one final thought from a colleague. And I took the challenge of taking into account labor and concerns on the farm in this case. The question on interventions is how consistently are they offered? I'm surprised time and time again looking at medication records, how little is done on the weekend, for instance. And understanding when things happen is important. What is finished when the lights go off, when we leave the barn, is a major concern. And sow care interventions fit somewhere below breeding the sows. It fit somewhere below, in some cases, even getting the dead sows out of the barn before they get bloated or the like. But simply understanding and having the resources and the emphasis in place seems to be a big difference. And so I'll leave it at that and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.